The silver pen, still cold from the signing chamber, rolled off the mahogany desk and struck the parquet floor with a sound like a judge's gavel. Prince Kalen froze mid-stride, watching the elegant instrument spin to a stop against the leg of his reading chair. The sound echoed through his private study, bouncing off walls lined with books his father had never read and maps of territories he would one day rule. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing in the smell of old leather and melting ice. Outside his window, the famous glacier of Glacier were doing something they hadn't done in living memory. They were dripping. Tiny streams of water ran down their ancient faces, catching the weak afternoon light and sparkling like liquid diamonds. Spring had come to the northern kingdom, and with it, peace. Kalen bent down and picked up the pen. Your Highness. The captain's voice cracked. He had to stop and swallow before continuing. The princess's carriage. The Solus delegation. They took the coastal road back south, against my advice. Said they wanted to see the Thor. Kalen waited. The silence stretched. There was an attack. In the mountain pass, just beyond the first checkpoint. Brennus stepped into the room, leaving wet footprints on the polished floor. The carriage is destroyed. 3 guards are dead. But the princess. Is she alive? Kalen's voice came out sharper than he intended. He felt the words leave his mouth before his brain approved them. Yes. She's alive. Badly shaken. A wound on her arm, nothing life-threatening. The captain paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. She's asking for you, Your Highness. By name. She won't speak to anyone else. Won't let the physicians near her until she sees you. Keep saying you promised safety. That the treaty guaranteed it. The treaty. The one still sitting on the signing table in the great hall, its ink barely dry. The one that was supposed to end all this. Kalen looked down at the crumpled letter in his hand. The warm paper. The curious questions about northern lights. He thought of a young woman alone in a shattered carriage, bleeding, surrounded by strangers in a frozen land, asking for someone she had never met because his name was the only one she trusted. The smell of wood smoke filled the room, mixing with the wet wool of the captain's uniform and the faint, sweet scent of something burning on the rug where the sparks had fallen. Kalen realized his hand was trembling slightly. He closed it into a fist, feeling the letter press against his palm. Get my horse ready, he said. And send word to the physician to meet us at the guardhouse nearest the pass. I want hot water, clean bandages, and warm blankets waiting before we arrive. Brennus nodded and turned to leave. And Captain. Kalen waited until the man looked back. Who did this? The captain's jaw tightened. We don't know yet. The survivors said the attackers wore no colors. No sigils. They came out of the ice, did their work, and vanished back into the storm. A storm that shouldn't exist. Not in the Thor. Not in March. Kalen looked at the window, at the water still streaming down the glass, at the impossible spring that had arrived on the same day as peace. The grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime, deep and resonant, marking the first hour of a new season. He crushed the letter gently in his palm, then smoothed it out again, carefully, as if it was something precious. Then he walked toward the door, leaving the silver pen where it lay on the floor, cold and forgotten. The Princess of Solus was waiting for him. And somewhere in the mountains between their kingdoms, in the melting ice of a centuries-old winter, someone had just tried to start a war. The ride to the mountain pass took 47 minutes that felt like 47 years. Kalen's horse, a grey stallion named Storm who had never once let him down, moved like the wind across the wet ground. Water splashed up from melting snow, soaking Kalen's boots and the bottom of his heavy cloak. He didn't notice. His hands held the reins so tight his knuckles had turned white, and his heart beat so hard he could feel it in his throat. Captain Brennus rode ahead, his horse kicking up mud that sprayed across Kalen's face. Behind them came 4 guards, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The sun had started its slow drop toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that would have been beautiful any other day. Today, Kalen barely saw them. They found the carriage just beyond the first checkpoint, where the coastal road narrowed between 2 steep walls of rock. The wreckage lay scattered across the frozen ground like a child's broken toy. One wheel had completely detached and rolled into a ditch. The door hung from a single hinge, swinging slightly in the wind. Dark stains marked the snow nearby, and Kalen looked away before his mind could finish processing what they were. 3 soulless guards lay wrapped in blankets off to the side, their faces covered. A 4th sat propped against a rock, his arm bandaged, staring at nothing. He didn't move when the horses approached, didn't blink when Kalen dismounted and walked past him. "Where is she?" Kalen's voice came out rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where is Princess Elia?" A young woman stepped out from behind the broken carriage. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue silk, now torn at the shoulder and streaked with mud. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and fell in tangles around her face. One sleeve had been cut away, and a strip of white linen wrapped her forearm, a small bloom of red seeping through the fabric. She was smaller than he expected. Younger too, though he knew she had just turned 23. In the formal portrait that had been sent ahead of the delegation, she looked every inch a princess, poised, distant, perfect. The woman standing before him now looked like someone who had stared death in the face and refused to look away. Prince Kalen. Her voice was steady. "Surprising. You came." He walked toward her, his boots crunching on patches of ice. Up close, he could see the slight tremor in her jaw, the way her fingers grip her torn sleeve a little too tight. She was holding it together by sheer will, and he recognized that look because he'd worn it himself more times than he could count. "Of course I came." He stopped an arm's length away, close enough to speak quietly but far enough to respect her space. "You asked for me." Something flickered in her dark eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or relief. "I didn't think they'd actually tell you. I thought they'd send a messenger with polite regrets and a basket of fruit." Despite everything, Kalen felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "We don't have much fruit in Glacier. Lemons, sometimes. They arrive twice a year and cost more than horses." A sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh, but close. It was the most human thing he'd heard all day. A medic approached, carrying a fresh roll of bandages and a ceramic cup that steamed in the cold air. "Your Highness, we should clean that wound properly. The bleeding has stopped, but—" Later. Elia didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on Kalen. "I need to speak with the prince first. Alone." The medic hesitated, looked at Kalen, received a small nod, and retreated. They walked a few steps away from the wreckage, finding a spot where the rock wall provided some shelter from the wind. Up close, Kalen could smell the faint scent of lavender on her clothes, mixed with the sharper smell of blood and snow. She was shivering, though she tried to hide it. The men who did this. He kept his voice low, careful. "What did you see?" Elia's jaw tightened. "Enough. There were 8 of them, maybe 9. They came out of the storm like they'd been waiting for hours. They knew exactly which carriage to hit, exactly when we'd be here. Their shields. Did they bear any markings? A sunburst from Solus? A glacier from Glacier?" She turned to face him fully, and for the first time, he saw the fire beneath her composure. They wore no sigils, no colors, no identifying marks at all. She paused, letting the words sink in. "They wanted me to see their faces, Kalen. They pulled me from the carriage and held me there, in the middle of the road, while they killed my guards. They made sure I watched. And then, right before they disappeared back into the storm, the leader looked at me and said, 'Tell your father the North remembers its enemies.'" The words hit Kalen like a physical blow. The North remembers its enemies. That phrase belonged to his father's inner circle. He'd heard it whispered in council chambers, muttered by old generals who still dreamed of southern conquests. "This wasn't random," he said slowly. "This wasn't bandits or deserters. No." Elia's voice dropped even lower. "Someone wants your treaty to fail. Someone wants my father to believe you betrayed us the moment the ink dried." Kalen looked back at the wreckage, at the covered bodies, at the guard who still stared at nothing. 3 men dead. A princess nearly killed. All to start a war. We need to get you somewhere safe. He turned back to her. Somewhere no one will think to look. My father's palace has 100 rooms, but it also has 100 ears. The moment you arrive, every spy in Frosthaven will know. Elia studied him for a long moment. You have another idea. It wasn't a question. Kaelin nodded. There's a library. In the oldest part of the palace. No windows, 1 door, and a heating system that barely works. My grandfather built it to hide his books from a fire that never came. Now it hides everything no one else is supposed to find. And you think I'll be safe there? I think, Kaelin said carefully, that it's the only place in Glacier where no one will think to look for a princess of Solace. Because no one knows it exists except me and the ghosts of kings who died 100 years ago. Elia was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and touched his arm, her fingers light against his sleeve. You're risking everything. Your throne. Your future. Possibly your life. For someone you met 40 minutes ago. Kaelin looked down at her hand, then up at her face. You asked for me. By name. When you had every reason to trust no one. That means something. The sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains now, painting the snow in shades of deep purple and blue. The temperature was dropping fast, and Elia's shivers had grown impossible to hide. We should go, Kaelin said. Can you ride? She lifted her chin. I can learn. 20 minutes later, they were moving through the mountains on a single horse. Elia seated in front of Kaelin with his cloak wrapped around both of them. She leaned back against him, whether from exhaustion or cold he couldn't tell, and he found himself adjusting his grip on the reins to keep her steady. Behind them, Captain Brennus and the guards followed at a distance, spreading out to watch for any sign of pursuit. The stars had begun to appear overhead, cold and bright, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the rising moon. As they approached a fork in the road, Kaelin made his choice. Instead of turning toward the palace gates, he guided Storm onto a narrow path that wound upward into the older part of the city. This road hadn't been used in decades. The cobblestones were slick with ice, and branches from overgrown trees scraped against them as they passed. Elia stirred against him. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, Kaelin repeated. Somewhere they'll never find you. He felt her relax slightly, her weight settling more fully against his chest. Above them, the northern lights began to dance across the sky, curtains of green and purple that shifted and flowed like something alive. Elia gasped softly. Is that? The northern lights, Kaelin confirmed. You asked about them in your letter. Whether they really sing. And do they? He thought about it, watching the color shift and change. No. But if you listen closely, really listen, you can hear the ice responding to them. A kind of crackling, like frozen fire. Some people call it the voice of the north. Elia was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly he almost missed it. It's more beautiful than I imagined. Kaelin guided the horse around a final bend, and there it stood, a small, unremarkable door set into the side of the oldest palace wall, hidden behind a century of overgrowth. He dismounted, helped Elia down, and produced an iron key that hadn't been used in his lifetime. The lock protested, grinding against decades of disuse, but finally turned with a heavy click. The door swung inward, revealing darkness and the faint smell of old paper and frozen dust. Kaelin looked at Elia, at her pale face and brave eyes and the bandage on her arm. Welcome to the only place in Glacier where you're truly safe. She stepped past him into the darkness, then turned back. And what about you? Where will you be safe? He thought of his father's court, of the generals who whispered about southern treachery, of the enemies he couldn't yet see. I'll be where I need to be, buying us time. Before she could respond, he lit a small lamp and handed it to her. The light caught her face, illuminating the exhaustion and fear she'd been hiding so well. Rest, he said gently. I'll return before dawn. He closed the door behind him, heard the lock click into place, and leaned his forehead against the cold stone for just a moment. Somewhere inside that hidden room, a princess he barely knew was trusting him with her life. Somewhere in the mountains, enemies he couldn't identify were plotting war. And somewhere in his chest, beneath the cold formality of 28 years of royal training, something had begun to thaw. 3 weeks had passed since Kaelin closed that hidden door. 3 weeks of lying to his father, avoiding his advisors, and sneaking through ancient passages in the dark hours before dawn. 3 weeks of watching Elia grow weaker while pretending everything was fine. The fever had started on the 5th day. A small thing at first, just a warmth to her skin and a tiredness she blamed on the journey. By the 7th day, she couldn't keep food down. By the 10th, she barely woke when Kaelin arrived with fresh water and the medicines he purchased from her apothecary on the other side of the city, paying in gold and praying the man asked no questions. Now, on the 21st day, Kaelin sat on the cold stone floor of the hidden library and watched the woman he loved die by inches. The room had changed in 3 weeks. The neat rows of ancient books, untouched for generations, now showed signs of life. A blanket on the leather chaise where Elia lay. A stack of clean bandages on the reading table. Empty cups and half-eaten bread. And everywhere, the smell of sickness, that sweet, sour scent of a body fighting something it couldn't beat. Kaelin dipped a cloth in a bowl of cold water and pressed it to Elia's forehead. She didn't stir. Her skin burned against his fingers, hot enough to make him pull back for just a moment before he forced himself to continue. Her dark hair lay spread across the pillow, damp and tangled. Her lips, usually so quick to smile at his stories, had cracked and peeled. The gash on her arm, the one from the attack, had healed cleanly, but something else had taken root in her lungs. Something the physicians would know how to treat if he could only call them. But he couldn't. He knew that. The moment anyone discovered Elia was hidden in the palace, the game would end. His father's council would use her as proof of conspiracy. They would drag her before the court, try her as a spy, and execute her before sunset. The treaty would shatter. The war would begin. And everything Kaelin had tried to prevent would come true anyway. So he sat on the cold floor, wringing out cloths and watching the fire flicker, and pretended his heart wasn't cracking piece by piece. Outside, the freak blizzard continued. The spring thaw that had greeted the treaty signing had reversed overnight into the worst storm in decades. Snow piled against the hidden door, sealing them in. Ice formed on the inside of the stone walls despite the small fireplace Kaelin kept burning day and night. The grandfather clock in the palace hallway, the one he could hear through the thick walls if he listened carefully, marked the hours like a funeral bell. Elia stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, searching the dim room until they found him. "You're still here." Her voice came out as barely a whisper, rough from days of silence. Kaelin leaned forward, taking her hand. It felt so small in his. So fragile. "I'm not going anywhere." A weak smile crossed her face. "Liar. You have a kingdom to run. Meetings to attend. Treaties to sign. The treaties can wait." He squeezed her hand gently. "The kingdom will survive without me for a few more hours." She closed her eyes again, and for a terrible moment he thought she'd slipped back into unconsciousness. But then she spoke, so softly he had to lean close to hear. "I dreamed of home. The gardens in the summer. The orange trees. My mother used to take me there when I couldn't sleep, and would count the stars until dawn." A tear escaped from beneath her closed lid and traced a path down her temple. "I don't want to die in this cold place, Kaelin. I don't want to die at all." The words hit him like a physical blow. He gripped her hand tighter, willing his strength into her, willing anything into her that might make her better. "You're not going to die." He said it firmly, as if saying it could make it true. "I won't let you." Her eyes opened again, and in them he saw something that broke him completely. Pity. She pitied him, this dying woman, for his foolish hope. 3 weeks, she whispered. "You've been here every night, bringing food, medicine, stories about your ridiculous northern lights, risking everything, every single day, for someone you barely know." She paused, gathering strength. "Why?" Kalen opened his mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Why? Because she'd asked for him after the attack. Because she'd trusted him when trust was the most dangerous thing in the world. Because she laughed at his terrible jokes and asked questions about his frozen kingdom like she actually cared about the answers. Because in 3 short weeks, she had become the only part of his life that felt real. But he couldn't say any of that. Not now. Not like this. Instead, he reached for the bowl of water and wrung out the cloth again, pressing it gently to her forehead. Rest. Save your strength. She caught his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong despite everything. Promise me something. Anything. If I don't make it through this. She stopped, swallowed, tried again. Promise me you won't let them use my death. Promise me you'll find another way to peace. Don't let my father march south for revenge. Don't let your father claim I was a spy. Promise me the treaty meant something, even if I'm not there to see it. Kalen stared at her, at this woman who lay dying in a hidden room because of him, and felt something shift deep in his chest. All his life, he'd done what was expected. Attended the meetings. Signed the documents. Smiled at the right people and said the right words. He'd been so careful, so proper, so perfectly royal. And for what? To watch the only person who'd ever made him feel human slip away in a freezing room while he sat helpless? I promise, he heard himself say. But you're going to be there to see it. You're going to walk through the gardens of Solace again. You're going to count stars with your mother. You're going to live, Elia. Do you hear me? You're going to live. Her hand went slack in his. For one horrible heartbeat, he thought she'd stopped breathing. But no, her chest still rose and fell, shallow but steady. She'd simply fallen unconscious again, exhausted by the effort of speaking. Kalen sat there for a long time, holding her hand, watching the fire burn low. The clock through the walls chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. The blizzard howled outside. The temperature dropped further, and he added another log to the fire, then another, desperate to keep the cold at bay. Sometime around 3 in the morning, he couldn't sit still any longer. He rose and walked to the small mirror that hung near the door, a relic from his grandfather's time, its surface spotted with age. The man who looked back at him was a stranger. Dark circles ringed his eyes. His normally neat hair stuck up in wild directions. His clothes, the same ones he'd worn for 3 days straight, hung loose on a frame that had lost weight he couldn't spare. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks, which was exactly what he was. But it wasn't the exhaustion that made him stare. It was the eyes. Looking back at him from that spotted mirror was someone he didn't recognize. Someone who had stopped being a prince somewhere along the way. Someone who had stopped being his father's son. Someone who had become... what? A traitor? A fool? A man in love with a woman who might not live to see morning? The realization hit him with the force of that silver pen striking the floor 3 weeks ago. He wasn't doing this because it was right. He wasn't doing this because of the treaty, or peace, or duty. He was doing this because she was the first person in 28 years who had looked at him and seen someone worth asking for. And his father, the man who had raised him, the king he had served his entire life, that man wanted her dead. The thought circled back, again and again, each time landing harder. The attack on the carriage. The attackers wearing no colors but speaking of northern enemies. The council's eagerness to blame Solus. The way his father had refused to investigate, had called it a southern trick, had moved to mobilize troops within a week of the incident. It couldn't be. It was impossible. His father was a hard man, a cold man, but he wasn't a murderer. He wouldn't order the death of an innocent woman just to start a war he'd wanted for 30 years. Would he? Kalen pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the mirror and closed his eyes. Behind him, Elia's breathing continued its shallow rhythm. Outside, the storm raged on. Somewhere in the palace, his father slept peacefully, untroubled by the chaos his choices had unleashed. And then Kalen realized the truth he'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. His father's promise of protection was a lie. The treaty had never been about peace. It had been a trap, carefully laid, designed to fail. The attack on Elia's carriage hadn't been a rogue operation or a misunderstanding. It had been ordered from the highest level, by the one man who stood to gain everything from a renewed war, the man who called himself Caelan's father. Caelan opened his eyes and looked at his reflection one last time. The stranger in the mirror looked back at him with something new in his gaze. Not despair. Not fear. Something harder, sharper, more dangerous. He turned away from the mirror and walked back to Elia's side. She was still breathing. Still fighting. Still alive. "Hold on," he whispered, taking her hand again. "Just a little longer. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to fix all of it." The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The clock chimed 4, and somewhere in the darkest hour before dawn, Prince Caelan of Glacier made a choice that would change everything. He chose her. Over his father. Over his throne. Over his kingdom and his future and his very life. He chose her, and in that choosing, became someone new. Someone the world had never seen before. Someone dangerous enough to start a war. Someone brave enough to stop one. The fever broke on the 22nd day, just before dawn. Caelan had been dozing in the chair beside her, his head resting on the edge of the chaise, when he felt a small hand touch his cheek. He woke with a start, heart pounding, and found Elia looking at him with clear eyes for the first time in 2 weeks. "You look terrible," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but the words were steady. The fog of fever had lifted. Caelan laughed. Actually laughed, a sound so foreign to his own ears that he startled himself. "You look like someone who almost died." "Almost." She smiled, a pale shadow of her usual grin but beautiful beyond words. "That's the key word, isn't it? Almost." He helped her sit up, supporting her back with one arm while he reached for water with the other. She drank slowly, carefully, and when she finished, she looked around the hidden library as if seeing it for the first time. How long? 22 days since the attack. 17 since the fever started. He paused. "I thought I lost you. 3 times. Elia. 3 nights I sat here holding your hand, waiting for you to take your last breath." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the dark circles under his eyes, the hollows in his cheeks. "You stayed. The whole time, you stayed." "I promised, didn't I?" A single tear escaped down her cheek. "You barely knew me. You could have handed me over 100 times. Saved yourself. Protected your throne. But you stayed." Caelan took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "I stayed because you're the first real thing that's ever happened to me. Everything else, the treaties, the meetings, the royal duties, it was all just words on paper. You're real. This is real. And I'm not letting it go." They sat like that for a long moment, wrapped in the silence of the hidden room, while the fire crackled and the storm continued its rage outside. But something had shifted. The fear that had gripped Caelan for 3 weeks had loosened its hold. In its place grew something harder, something sharper, something that looked a lot like purpose. "We need to move," he said finally. "Today. Now. While you're strong enough." Elia's eyes widened. "Move where? Your father's guards are everywhere. The moment I step outside this room." "The moment you step outside, we control the story." Caelan stood and began gathering supplies. "My father thinks you're dead. The council thinks you're dead. The whole kingdom thinks the Princess of Solace didn't survive the attack. That's our advantage." He pulled a heavy cloak from a chest in the corner, one of his own, lined with fur. "They'll announce your death tomorrow at the council meeting. Use it as proof of southern treachery. March on Solace within the week." Elia swung her legs over the side of the chaise, swaying slightly. Caelan was at her side instantly, steadying her. "Then we stop them," she said. "How?" "By walking into that council meeting and showing them you're alive. By telling them the truth about the attack. By making them see that my father—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "By making them see that my father has been lying to them for 30 years." Elia studied his face. You're sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. He's your father, Kalen. Your king. He stopped being my father the moment he ordered your death. Kalen's voice was flat, empty of emotion. I'm sure. They moved through the hidden passages like ghosts, Kalen leading, Ilya following close behind. The tunnels hadn't been used in decades, and dust rose with every step, making them cough and cover their mouths. But Kalen knew every turn, every hidden door, every secret stair. His grandfather had shown him these passages when he was 7 years old, swearing him to secrecy, telling him that a king needed to know where to hide. He never imagined he'd use them to bring down a king. They emerged in a storage room behind the great hall, the faint sound of voices reaching them through the thick door. Kalen pressed his ear to the wood, counting. At least 20. Maybe more. The full council, plus generals, plus. He stopped, recognizing a voice. His father's voice, deep and commanding, addressing the room. The Princess of Solace is dead. Killed by her own people in a failed attempt to frame us for attack. We have witnesses. We have proof. The treaty is void, and the time for action is now. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Kalen felt Ilya's hand find his, squeezing tight. General Marek, what's the status of our troops? Ready and waiting, Your Majesty. 10,000 men at the southern pass. Another 5,000 mobilizing as we speak. We can march within 3 days. 3 days. They had 3 days before the largest army Glacier had ever assembled crossed into Solace and started a war that would kill tens of thousands. Kalen looked at Ilya. She looked back at him, fear and determination warring in her dark eyes. Then she nodded. He pushed open the door. The great hall fell silent. 47 faces turned toward the storage room, toward the prince who had been missing for weeks, toward the woman who was supposed to be dead. Kalen walked forward, Ilya's hand in his, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. His father stood at the head of the long table, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and finally settling on something dark and dangerous. General Marek's hand moved toward his sword. Council members whispered behind their hands. Father. Kalen's voice carried to every corner of the room. I believe you've met Princess Ilya of Solace. The king recovered quickly. 30 years on the throne had taught him how to hide his feelings. This is a surprise. We were told you didn't survive the attack. The attack you ordered. Ilya stepped forward, her voice stronger than Kalen expected. The attack carried out by your men, wearing no colors, speaking your words. The attack designed to kill me and blame my father. Gasps rippled through the room. General Marek's hand left his sword. Council members exchanged glances. The king laughed. A cold, humorless sound. Ridiculous. The girl is feverish, confused. She doesn't know what she's saying. She knows exactly what she's saying. Kalen released Ilya's hand and walked toward the table, toward his father. I know about the meeting. The one 3 weeks before the treaty was signed. I know you met with 6 generals in the private chamber. I know you planned the attack. I know you've been waiting 30 years for an excuse to march south, and when peace got in the way, you decided to destroy it. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Then the king did something unexpected. He smiled. Clever boy. He shook his head slowly, almost admiringly. I always knew you had potential. Too soft, too concerned with right and wrong, but smart. Very smart. He gestured to the council. And now what? You'll tell them the truth? You think they'll believe you over their king? Kalen reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. I think they'll believe the orders written in your own hand. The ones you gave to Captain Brennis. The ones I found in your private desk 3 nights ago. For the first time, the king's composure cracked. His hand reached for the paper, then stopped. You wouldn't. I would. Kalen held up the document, showing the royal seal, the signature, the date. This orders the attack on the Solace delegation. This names the men to carry it out. This proves, beyond any doubt, that you tried to murder an innocent woman to start a war. General Marek stepped forward, his weathered face unreadable. Your Majesty, is this true? The king looked at his oldest friend, his most trusted general. Something passed between them, some understanding born of decades together. Then the king straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin. It's true. He said it simply, without shame, without apology. Every word. And I'd do it again. The South has grown fat and lazy on their sun and their trade. They mock us. They call us frozen barbarians. They forget that we are the ones who held the passes against invaders for 1,000 years. A war would remind them. A war would unite us. A war would make Glacier strong again. Kalen stared at his father, this stranger in royal robes, and felt something finally break. The last thread of connection, the last hope that maybe he'd misunderstood, maybe there was some explanation, gone. You killed 3 men, he said quietly. Good men who served you faithfully. You killed them to prove a point. You almost killed her, he gestured to Elia, still standing tall despite her weakness. To start a fight that would cost thousands more. And you call that strength? The king's eyes flashed. I call it leadership. Something you've never understood. You hide in libraries. You read old books. You sign treaties with people who despise you. You're weak, Kalen. You always have been. I'm not weak. Kalen's voice rose for the first time, filling the hall. I'm something you've never been. I'm human. I feel things. I love things. I'd rather lose a throne than sacrifice my soul to keep it. He turned to the council, to the generals, to the 47 people whose choices would determine the future of 2 kingdoms. You've heard the truth. You've seen the proof. Now you have to decide. Do you follow a man who would murder innocent people for power? Or do you stand with peace, with honor, with the future? Silence stretched. No one moved. Then General Marek stepped forward. He walked to the king, looked him in the eye, and said 8 words that would echo through history. I serve Glacier, not the man who betrays her. He moved to stand beside Kalen. One by one, the others followed. Council members, generals, advisors. Some moved quickly, eager to be on the winning side. Others moved slowly, reluctantly, but they moved. Within 5 minutes, the king stood alone at the head of the table, surrounded by people who had served him for decades and now refused to meet his eyes. Arrest him, General Marek ordered. Hold him in the North Tower until we decide what to do. Guards stepped forward. The king didn't resist. He looked at Kalen one last time, and in his eyes Kalen saw something unexpected. Not anger. Not hatred. Something closer to pride, buried so deep it took a moment to recognize. You're stronger than I thought, the king said quietly. Stronger than me, maybe. I hope it serves you better than it served me. They led him away. The door closed behind them. And Kalen stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by people waiting for him to speak, to lead, to tell them what came next. He looked at Elia. She smiled, weak but real, and nodded. Then he walked to the head of the table, to the place his father had occupied for 30 years, and picked up the treaty. The one signed in ice. The one that had started everything. He held it over the brazier. The treaty is already ash, Kalen said, his voice low but clear. The only choice left is whether you burn with it, or step into the sun. The paper caught fire. Flames curled the edges, consuming the signatures, the seals, the promises written in cold ink. A single spark floated upward, dancing in the warm air of the great hall. Kalen opened his hand. The burning treaty fell toward the marble floor. And everything changed. The silver pen sat on the wooden table, warm in the afternoon sun that streamed through the open door. 12 months had passed since it last struck the floor of a palace study, since it last heard the chime of a grandfather clock marking the death of one world and the birth of another. Now it rested in sunlight, in silence, in a place so different from where it started that the pen itself seemed changed. Kalen picked it up and turned it over in his fingers. The metal still bore the tiny scratch from its fall, a small imperfection in an otherwise perfect surface. He remembered the sound it made that night, the way it echoed through his study like a warning he hadn't understood, the way everything changed the moment it left his hand. Behind him, footsteps approached on the stone path. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. "You're thinking about it again." Ilya's voice, warm and familiar, carried the hint of a smile. "I can always tell. You get this look, like you're somewhere far away." Kalen set the pen down carefully and turned to face her. She stood in the doorway of their cottage, arms full of wildflowers she'd picked from the meadow beyond the garden. The scar on her arm had faded to a thin white line, barely visible against her skin. Her dark hair, no longer pinned in royal styles, fell loose around her shoulders and caught the sunlight like threads of gold. "Not far away," he said. "Just back. For a moment." She walked to the table and laid the flowers beside the pen. Then she sat in the chair across from him, close enough to touch, and did. Her hand found his on the table, warm and real and alive. "1 year," she said softly. "Can you believe it? A year since we walked into that hall. A year since you burned the treaty. A year since his father had been led away in chains. A year since General Marek had taken temporary control of the kingdom, promising fair elections and honest governance. A year since Kalen and Ilya had slipped away in the chaos, leaving behind thrones and titles and expectations. They'd come here, to this cottage on the border between their kingdoms. Not quite Glacier. Not quite Solus. A small piece of land that belonged to no one and everyone, with a chipped blue door that didn't lock and a garden that grew vegetables alongside wildflowers. The locals called it the Peace Cottage now. Travelers left small gifts at the gate, bread, fruit, sometimes letters from people they'd never meet, thanking them for choosing love over war. Kalen squeezed her hand. "I can believe it. I lived it. Every moment." A noise outside made them both turn. A small boy, maybe 5 years old, had stopped at the garden gate. He stared at the cottage with wide eyes, clutching a piece of paper in one hand. Kalen stood and walked to the gate. The boy took a step back, nervous, then held out the paper. "For the prince," he whispered. "Mama said to give it to the prince." Kalen knelt down to the boy's level. "I'm not a prince anymore. Just Kalen. What's your name?" "Thomas." The boy looked at him with wonder. "Mama said you stopped a war. She said you were brave." "I was scared," Kalen said honestly. "Every single minute. But sometimes being scared doesn't stop you from doing what's right." Thomas thought about this for a moment, then nodded seriously. He handed over the paper, a drawing, crudely done in charcoal, of 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a sun and a glacier. In wobbly letters at the bottom, someone had written, "Thank you." Kalen felt something catch in his throat. He blinked rapidly and smiled at the boy. "Thank your mama for me. This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me." Thomas beamed, then turned and ran back down the path toward the village. Kalen watched him go, the drawing held carefully in both hands, until the boy disappeared around a bend. When he turned back to the cottage, Ilya had come to the door. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching him with that look she got when she was about to say something important. "You miss it," she said. Not a question. Kalen walked back to her, the drawing still in his hands. Some days. The library, mostly. And the feeling of being able to help more people. But then a boy brings a drawing, and I remember that this, he gestured at the cottage, the garden, the meadow beyond. This matters too. Maybe more. Ilya reached out and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. You could go back. Any time. The council would welcome you. The people would cheer. I could. He turned his head and kissed her palm. But I won't. I made my choice a year ago, in that hall, in front of everyone. I chose you. I choose you. Every single day, I choose you. She smiled, that real smile he'd fallen in love with, the one that reached her eyes and crinkled the corners. Good. Because I choose you too. And I have a feeling we are going to be choosing each other for a very long time. They stood there for a moment, in the doorway of their cottage, in the warm spring sunshine, holding each other. The chipped blue door had been painted twice since they arrived, but the blue always chipped again, and they'd stopped caring. It was theirs. Imperfect and real and theirs. Later, after they'd arranged the wildflowers in a clay pot and hung the boy's drawing on the wall beside the door, Callan found himself back at the table. The silver pen still lay where he'd left it, warm from the sun, catching the light. He picked it up one more time. 12 months ago, this pen had signed a treaty meant to bring peace. Instead, it had brought danger, discovery, and ultimately, a love he never expected. The treaty was ash now, scattered to the winds. But the pen remained. Changed, like them. Warmer. Lighter. Ready for whatever came next. A soft sound outside made him look up. A massive icicle, the last remnant of winter clinging to the cottage eaves, had finally let go. It fell to the stone path and shattered into 100 pieces, each one catching the sun and sparkling like diamonds before melting into the ground. Spring had won. Finally. Completely. Forever. Elia came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her chin on his shoulder. They watched the melted ice soak into the stones, watched the flowers sway in the breeze, watched the sun climb higher in a sky that held no threat of storm. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Callan set the pen down one last time. He covered her hands with his, feeling her warmth, her presence, her life. "I'm thinking," he said, "that ice melts. Treaties burn. Kingdoms fall. But this," he squeezed her hands, "this lasts." She laughed, that wonderful sound that still made his heart skip after all these months. "That's very poetic for a man who claims he can't write." "I can't. But I'm learning." He turned in her arms and faced her, his hands moving to her waist. "Every day, I'm learning." They stood there for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. The sun warmed their backs. The flowers scented the breeze. And somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, marking the hour, marking the day, marking the beginning of everything they'd fought for. That evening, as the sun set over the meadow and the first stars appeared in a sky finally free of clouds, they sat on the cottage steps and watched the northern lights begin their dance. Green and purple, shifting and flowing, painting the darkness with color. Elia leaned her head against his shoulder. "They're singing tonight." Callan smiled into her hair. "They are." "No, really." She sat up and looked at him, eyes sparkling. "Listen." He listened. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, a crackling sound. Like frozen fire. Like ice responding to light. Like the voice of the north, welcoming spring, welcoming peace, welcoming them. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Not as beautiful as you." He said it simply, without embarrassment, without hesitation. Just truth. She kissed him then, soft and warm and full of promise. And when she pulled back, she was smiling that smile again, the one that had changed everything. "We should write a book," she said. "About everything that happened. So people remember." Callan looked at the cottage, at the chipped blue door, at the drawing on the wall inside, at the silver pen still sitting on the table. "We should. But not tonight." "No." She raised an eyebrow. "What should we do tonight?" He stood and offered her his hand. "Tonight, we watch the lights. Tomorrow, we write the story. And every day after that, we live it." She took his hand and let him pull her up. Together, they walked into the meadow, away from the cottage, away from the past, toward the dancing lights and the endless possibilities of a future they'd fought for and won. Behind them, on the wooden table, the silver pen caught the light of the northern sky. Warm now. Ready. Waiting for the story that would begin tomorrow. But tonight, there were only two people, holding hands beneath the stars, watching spring paint the sky with color. Tonight, there was only peace.